Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Preface, Paragraph 2. Furthermore, the very attempt to define how a philosophical work is supposed to be connected with other efforts to deal with the same subject matter drags in an extraneous concern, and what is really important for the cognition of the truth is obscured. The more conventional opinion gets fixated on the antithesis of truth and falsity, the more it tends to expect a given philosophical system to be either accepted or contradicted, and hence it finds only acceptance or rejection. It does not comprehend the diversity of philosophical systems as the progressive unfolding of truth, but rather sees in it simple disagreements. The bud disappears in the bursting forth of the blossom, and one might say that the former is refuted by the latter. Similarly, when the fruit appears, the blossom is shown up in its turn as a false manifestation of the plant, and the fruit now emerges as the truth of it instead. These forms are not just distinguished from one another, they also supplant one another as mutually incompatible. Yet at the same time, their fluid nature makes them moments of an organic unity in which they not only do not conflict, but in which each is as necessary as the other. And this mutual necessity alone constitutes the life of the whole. But he who rejects a philosophical system, i.e., the new philosopher, does not usually comprehend what he is doing in this way. And he who grasps the contradiction between them, i.e., the historian of philosophy, does not, as a general rule, now know how to free it from its one-sidedness, or maintain it in its freedom by recognizing the reciprocally necessary moments that take shape as a conflict and seeming incompatibility. Okay, so we are moving on then from that first paragraph in which he gives us that very surprising observation that basically the whole idea of writing a preface to a philosophical work is kind of ridiculous because it can't really, it's not on the level of other sciences. Philosophy, he says, works in the element of universality, and since a preface can at best only isolate particular propositions, we end up lacking that element of universality. But here he goes even further by saying that the preface is doubly stupid because the philosophy can never really be captured by the conclusions or the propositions or the doctrines. And if we try and go through the history of philosophy and treat the various schools or doctrines or movements or whatever as options for us to decide are they true or false, then there's a kind of naivete about that. There's a naivete in simply agreeing or disagreeing with ideas. What Hegel seems to want us to do instead, he's really going to want to historicize philosophy itself. The idea is that you can't really think these thoughts unless you think them according to the same process by which they emerge historically, so that the various competing or mutually incompatible philosophical doctrines or schools turn out to be moments in a longer process. And if we want to apprehend philosophy in its universality, we have to understand the whole thing. We can't just choose between skepticism or stoicism, or between materialism and idealism, or if we're talking about, say, the medieval debate about universals. It can't just be realism versus nominalism, where we decide which one is the better argument. Instead, we have to view these as distinct moments in the temporal process. These are attitudes that one has to pass through. We need to understand them from the inside. We need to sort of relive them in the same way that the historic skeptics and Stoics and realists and nominalists and so forth actually lived through those ideas. We're not too far away, I think, from a kind of Marxist symptomatic reading in that respect. I don't think Hegel would have made sense much of the idea of a symptomatic reading, but nevertheless, he thinks that there's something kind of silly about simply approaching philosophical ideas in terms of which ones are true and which ones are false. In some sense, they're always all going to be both. We have to understand their relationship to one another, how they grow out of one another, rather than simply isolating, the true propositions from the false propositions. And he, I think, really very brilliantly illustrates that with this funny little parable about the blossom and the bud. And I think maybe there's almost I don't know if you call this a joke exactly. Hegel does have a sense of humor, but his jokes are usually pretty abstruse. But there is something a little funny about the way he phrases this. The bud disappears in the bursting forth of the blossom, and one might say that the former is refuted by the latter. There's something I find that kind of amusing to think of, when the flower actually appears on the branch, it shows up as the truth of the plant, and also it shows up as a kind of denial or negation or refutation of whatever happened before. If on the day before what was there was a bud, and the day after what appears as a blossom, then somehow the bud has been exposed as an untrue or insufficient form. But he then goes on to say in the very next part of the sentence, similarly, when the fruit appears, the blossom is shown up in its turn as a false manifestation of the plant, and the fruit now emerges as the truth of it instead. So we go from a first phase where the flower is the refutation of the flowerless branch or the bud, to a second phase in which the fruit of the tree becomes the denial or negation or refutation of the flower. And whatever comes after the fruit, I suppose, would then be a refutation of that. And I think that's obviously kind of a ridiculous image, to think of the flower refuting the forms that gave rise to it. I think what he's doing is poking fun at our propensity to want to describe any one form or any one moment in the process as the truth of it. We don't really get the truth until we've apprehended the entire process, and apprehended the way all of its moments relate to one another, grow out of one another. If we're simply experiencing them as independent forms that don't speak to one another, or that aren't defined by one another, then we're landed in that very naive, I think what he's going to later refer to as Verstand, which he more or less identifies with kind of the bourgeois, common sense, empiricist view of things. That says to itself, of course, a proposition is either true or false, or either a proposition or its opposite. Only one of them can be true. And Hegel wants to forge a very different version of truth that involves sort of tracing these moments growing out of one another, so that they may in turn expose one another as error relative to some sort of later form. But we can't really be satisfied with saying that any one form is the truth.